Good evening. Let's see here. I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University. And I'd like to welcome you this evening to our program where Ambassador Ryan Crocker and I are going to talk about Afghanistan, the current state, how we got there, nation building, and what we've left behind and what we've destroyed by leaving the way we did. Ambassador Crocker is one of the most distinguished diplomats, career diplomats in our foreign service. He served for 37 years, retired in April of 2009, but then was recalled by President Obama in 2011 to serve as the US ambassador to Afghanistan. He also served as ambassador to Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. And he served as a foreign service officer at a lower level in Iran, Qatar, Egypt, and Beirut earlier in his career. He was given the highest civilian medal in the US government, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, in 2009. And I might add, for those of you who don't know a lot about the Foreign Service, it is an honor and to be an ambassador once. To be an ambassador 6 times, Ryan, 2, 4, 6 times is very, very unusual. In fact, I think only Tom Pickering and you have reached that level of, and I might, these were not easy assignments. Every one of them was a difficult assignment. And so that tells you something about Ambassador Crocker's, through Republican and Democratic administrations, how well and how highly he is regarded. So Ryan, let me start off by, I was, just so you know, I was the head of USAID for 5 years. And so Ryan and I got into an argument as the Taliban was shelling the American embassy. We're standing outside the embassy, as I recall, in January of 2002, just a few months after 9/11, when Ryan was sent into as charge d'affaires to start up the embassy again. You reminded me of that when you became the dean of the Bush School, and I am a professor here. But Ryan, let's just track this a little bit. Why did we go first to Afghanistan? That should be kind of obvious, but why did we stay there for 20 years?
Well, it's the same answer to both questions, Andrew. We went because of 9/11, obviously. 9/11 came to us from Al Qaeda, which sheltered under the protection of the Taliban government, giving them the time and the space and the security to put together the 9/11 attacks. Our intervention was to ensure that never again would Afghan soil be the staging area for another 9/11. That, again, was very clear, I think, to all of us at the time, and it never changed. But we're now into this trope of, well, mission creep, mission change. We somehow skewed off into nation building. And it's, well, I'm really glad you asked me to do this, because you were present at that creation as well in a critical role as administrator of USAID. And you certainly knew what you were about, what we were all about at the time. So the nation building aspect of this was, given that our aim is ensuring our own national security, how do we best do that? And you, well, I should just turn this question right back to you. I saw your response even before your visit. You had ordered the reopening or opening of girls' schools as probably the first thing that USAID did in Afghanistan, other than humanitarian aid. And that's, as I've written, I took then Senator Joe Biden to visit one of those girls' schools in Kabul, a first grade class. And it was a moving moment, because those first graders ranged in age from 6 to 12. the 12-year-olds not having had the chance of education because they became of school age when the Taliban was in charge and denied them that opportunity. And it was the right thing to do. It was one of those wonderful moments when our national security interests and our values as Americans perfectly coincided. That to begin educating or re-educating the female half of the Afghan population was not just the right thing to do ethically, it was tied to the national security imperative. So that for 20 years, at least in my view, that never changed. It was always about America's security. The debates were about what are the best ways to achieve that.
And let me just add a couple of things in terms of the Reconstruction accomplishments. One thing I want to clarify, AID has never engaged, nor has the US government, in nation building. They have engaged in state building, which is very different. Building a nation takes a century. The only modern example of it working was the British Raj in India, where they essentially, this is what Frank Fukuyama argues, that took 100 years. And some people could argue that the principalities that made up India when they made India a colony of Great Britain, the Raj as it's called, they created a state which exists to this day. We don't engage in nation building, we engage in state building, which is mean we develop the government structures and we develop the economy. And that has actually been very successful all over the world for a very long time. And I'll give you several examples in Asia during the Cold War. We invested $6 billion after the Korean War in South Korea, which is one of the poorest countries with the highest malnutrition rates in the late 1950s. Now, South Korea has the 11th or 12th largest economy in the world. It has twice the college graduation rate as the United States does. It took 25 years to do what we did in South Korea. We finally closed the aid mission there, USAID mission, in the early 1980s. I believe it was in 82. And it wasn't even clear it was working because it takes a long time to do this stuff. We did have peace. We had the horrendous war that killed a couple million people in South Korea, but we didn't have it going on when we were doing the reconstruction itself. We did the same thing in Taiwan. We did it in Indonesia. We did it in Thailand. And those were highly successful as well. I mean, Thailand is a middle income country, so is Indonesia. South Korea and Taiwan are advanced industrial democracies in the same category as Japan, Australia, the United States, and Canada. Were those a success story? Yes, they were. We did the same thing in Greece and Turkey. I think we shut down the Turkey mission a little bit prematurely, which is why we've got Erdogan in our hands now. But I could go through a lot of other success stories around the world. So the notion that this doesn't work is utter nonsense. And it shows an ignorance of the development process and what AID has done. There's a new book out on this by John Norris, A History of AID, which I would commend you, just came out in the last year. But let's go back to Afghanistan. There were 900,000 kids in school, according to UNICEF, when we arrived, when Ryan and I were having that discussion in front of the embassy. When we left, just in the last few months, there were 9.5 million children in school, 39% of whom are girls. And there were only 8% of the school children in school who were girls when we arrived. So there's been a dramatic increase in the number of kids in school and the number of children who, of girl children in school. The child mortality rates and the maternal mortality rates in Afghanistan were the highest in the world. We were at the same level as Sierra Leone, the two highest countries in the post-World War II period. There's been a 50% reduction in child mortality and maternal mortality through the building of health clinics and the training of health staff, Afghans around the country. Now, how much of this will continue in the future, we cannot tell. You can't undo literacy. Once people learn how to read and write, they can read and write. Now, the Taliban's already said that they're going to not allow girls in college. But how this will play out in terms of what goes on in the cities in the future, I don't know. We'll find out. Has Taliban, let me go back to you, Ryan, has Taliban learned anything from when they were tacitly in control of the country in the late 1990s?
I think they've learned a great deal. The most important thing they've learned, sadly, is a lesson being absorbed not just by the Taliban, but throughout the world. The Americans don't have the stomach for the long fight. You can outlast them, which is precisely what they did. And again, the consequences, I think, of our rush to the exit are going to be felt by us for many years to come. We have empowered not only the Taliban, we've empowered every extremist group under the banner of Islam, that you can wait them out. They actually got that early on. There was a famous one-liner attributed to the Taliban. You Americans may have the watches, but we have the time. And they just proved it. And the images of the fall of Kabul, that desperate rush of Afghans to the airport to try to literally cling to a C-17 and then falling off as it lifted off the ground to their deaths. It makes Saigon look orderly. So they will trade on that now for years to come. That clad only in the armor of the one true faith, they vanquished the Americans on the battlefield. And we're going to pay for that lesson we taught them for a long time to come. And so will others. I was ambassador to Pakistan for 3 years in the mid-2000s. I had a number of spirited conversations with Pakistani officials on their harboring of the Taliban leadership, as well as very lethal fighters, primarily from the Haqqani group in the tribal areas. As we got to know each other, as my 3-year tour went on, the case they made was, look, we were the most allied of your allies during the anti-Soviet jihad. That was, of course, these fighters were trained by us in Pakistan, on Pakistani soil, to join the fight against the Soviets. And it worked. The Soviets, of course, withdrew in defeat in the end of the 1980s, and it was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, incidentally. And then we left too. Even though we could see the civil war coming in Afghanistan, the only thing that had held the Mujahideen groups together was a common enemy. You remove that and you got an absolutely predictable civil war. So we left that civil war on Pakistan's doorstep, and we did something else. We'd been seeking and getting waivers for the Pressler Amendment, legislation that required the cessation of all United States economic or military aid to any country pursuing a nuclear weapons program, which the Pakistanis had announced they were doing. But because it was in our interest, each year we got a waiver until the Soviets left. And then the waiver stopped. So in the Pakistani narrative, they went from being the most allied of allies to the most sanctioned of adversaries, almost literally overnight. And facing again a national security threat on their own borders, they backed the Taliban because the Taliban looked like it could finally stop the fighting that was endangering Pakistan's own stability. And then there is 9/11 and the Americans are back. So again, the Pakistani narrative, glad to see you back. Happy to get the assistance again. We'll see how long it lasts. and happy to join you in trying to hunt down Al-Qaeda. We don't like them either. But if you think we're going to turn the Taliban into a mortal enemy of Pakistan to please you, when we know you're going to leave sooner or later, you're nuts. We're not going to do that. And of course, that argument was vindicated. We left. We just got tired of it and we left. But here's the hook. Pakistanis probably had about 15 minutes of high-fiving in the halls of power in Rawalpindi and Islamabad. And then reality set in. Because our retreat, the Taliban seizing power yet again, the Pakistanis got it right away. That inspires groups like the Pakistani Taliban, who aim at the overthrow of the government in Islamabad. It inspired the Kashmiri separatists. Never mind that these groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba were in effect created by the Pakistanis to press India, going all the way back to partition. Pakistan lost control of them, and they now threaten the Pakistani state. These groups have been empowered by our action, and the Pakistanis are scared. We should be scared too. Look, it's what is it? The world's 6th most populous nation. It's got the 7th largest standing army. Oh, and it has nuclear weapons. If the Pakistani state collapses through a Taliban-like takeover, the world just got a whole lot more dangerous. So that's the lesson that I fear we have taught all. The Americans will go home if you just keep the pressure on them. They don't have the patience. Summon it, you will win. So these aftershocks are going to be with us for a very long time.
Putin said something last week. He said, or the Russian government, I think Putin said it himself, to the Europeans, he said, the Americans are going to abandon you and abandon NATO like they did Afghanistan. So there was, people think that they're making, in Washington, think they're making policy for one country. I mean, people do read across the whole world, everything we do. And so they all take messages from this. It's not just the Islamists who do. Putin is sending these messages to Europe, which could destabilize Europe.
Well, it was a pretty neat trick when you think of it. You may recall how unhappy NATO was with President Trump's decision to cut a very small American force by half, from 5,000 to 2,500, without consultations with NATO. It appears that it was even worse under President Biden, where he decided on and announced the full pullout of US forces without any consultations with NATO. And they had to go through all kinds of hoops to generate the capacity to pull their forces out. They didn't want to do it. They were ready to stay. We weren't. So it's kind of a nifty twist by Putin of the Afghan narrative from their ignominious defeat in 1989, now shifting over to our ignominious defeat, self-administered in 2021.
One of the things that I'm not sure the public gets entirely, and I hope our students understand, is this didn't start with President Biden. The agreement that he was carrying out was in fact negotiated by President Trump and by Zal Khalilzad, who was his special envoy to Afghanistan. One of the provisions of that agreement was to release 5,000 Afghan fighters, including many commanders, from the prison at the Bagram Air Force Base, if I'm not mistaken. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so look, for years, the Taliban has been saying, we're ready to talk to the Americans anytime, but we won't do it if they have their puppet regime in the room. And that was mail. We simply didn't bother answering. It was on the table when I was there in 2011 and 2012. President Trump decided that that was the way to go, and authorized talks headed by Ambassador Khalilzad with the Taliban without Afghan government representation. And I said at the time and subsequently, these are not peace talks, these are surrender negotiations. This is the Paris peace talks that on Vietnam all over again. John Negroponte, one of the stellar foreign service officers of any generation, really took that to heart. He had been a brand new foreign service officer in Paris, staffing those talks. And he said, wow, it is, here we go again. This is about the US getting out. It is not about anything else. As it played out, Paris and Vietnam looked like a success. We had 2 full years before the collapse of the Saigon regime. We had 15 minutes in Kabul. So, you know, that it was that decision to sit down with the Taliban without the Afghan government, authorized by President Trump, that was the beginning of the end we saw a couple of months ago in August. And the release of the 5,000 prisoners, a major part of that. How that demoralized the Afghan National Security Forces, I leave it to your imagination. They knew what was going to happen when those doors were opened, that those fighters and commanders were going to be right back in the fight against them. So let's face it, I mean, we sold the Afghan government and its security forces. We just sold them out. And of course, the Afghan people, particularly the women and girls.
Let me mention again some of the accomplishments of the Reconstruction program. 2,000 kilometers of highway and road were constructed. Now they're going to deteriorate if they're not maintained. We did build some capacity in the Public Works Ministry to do that. That if they start firing all of the career people we've been training all these 20 years, the ministries will not be able to function. And it took a long time to build a functioning state in some of these ministries, and many of the ministries are still not functional, but the critical ones, like the health ministry is one of the best ministries. And they did a superb job, actually. It's one of the best health ministries I've seen in the developing world. That's why the death rates came down so dramatically for women and children. One of the other success stories is in agriculture, and that I'm not sure they can undo that unless they go around literally burning farmers down. I don't know why they would do that. The agricultural exports in Afghanistan went from something like $388 million a year. This is non-heroin. This is legitimate agriculture, and up to something like 900 million last year. So there was a dramatic increase in the amount of exports over a period of time that's very sustainable. These are commercial enterprises. They're processing plants that we helped start. We also worked on setting up higher education institutes. There was an American university in Kabul. I don't know whether, has it been shut down, Ryan? Do you know?
Not officially. They are doing classes by remote.
By remote. There is also a teachers college there, and it had 50 students. And when we arrived, went up to 900 students to become teachers, to train Afghan teachers. One of the other things we did was a curriculum for the schools. We printed something like 80 million textbooks over that period of time, and all subjects except for religion. We didn't want to publish religion textbooks, but they were used in the schools along with a huge teacher training program. So the education system has been improved. Again, all of this will gradually deteriorate if they simply politicize things and put the fighters, which they will probably do, in ministries and these jobs. The problem is, of course, they don't have any money to pay these people. And so they can put them in the jobs, but there's not going to be much money from anyone. Let me ask you another question, because some writers have said, columnists, that the Chinese are going to come in and save Afghanistan's finances. What's the chance of that happening, Ryan, in your view?
Precisely zero. I think we attribute to China motives and initiatives that would make sense to us that we might act on. I think the Chinese see it differently. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, for example, the main problem we had with the Chinese during my time in office in both countries was not that they were doing too much, but that they were doing too little. They've cultivated a relationship with Pakistan, which the Pakistanis, of course, were extremely interested in as a bulwark against India. It's balance of power geometry. But they never really used their influence in Pakistan for political or national security objectives. When I, shortly after I arrived, it was right as I arrived as ambassador to Pakistan, a couple of Chinese engineers were kidnapped in the Pakistani tribal areas, and in an attempt to secure their release by Afghan military, I think they were both killed. So I went to see the Chinese ambassador. My introductory call, and I said, well, look, we've got some shared interests and some shared concerns in Pakistan. I'm sorry for the loss of your engineers. Don't you think it might be worth making a joint démarche to the foreign minister on the absolutely imperative step of clamping down on terrorist elements on Pakistani soil? He just went blank, switched the subject to the growing of soybeans as a cash crop, and got me out of his office as fast as he could. The Chinese do not want to go there. Similarly, in Afghanistan, they got a huge copper concession. Part of the deal was they were supposed to build a rail link and a set of roads to improve communications for Afghans generally. They reneged, they never did it. So the notion that the Chinese are all set to replace us in countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan, it just bespeaks a kind of a lack of understanding of how China operates diplomatically. They're not geared for that. It takes a long time to develop those skills, and they certainly are not there yet.
There is a media report, and I have other friends who've told me the story, but it's in the media that Russia is moving weapons to the Northern Alliance, to the Panjshir Valley, through Tajikistan, and the foreign minister of Pakistan called the president of Tajikistan to threaten him. You have to stop this immediately. It's outrageous. You cannot do this. Now, Putin, of course, denies that they're sending any weapons in, but where do Tajikistan get those kind of weapons? I was shocked that the Panjshir Valley, which never fell to the Soviets during that whole period, fell so quickly. And what I've been told by Afghans, but I've also been told by intelligence people that we've misunderstood what happened. The Panjshir Tajiks did not fight at all. They let them take over so that they get all the women and children out of the valley into refugee camps in neighboring countries, particularly Tajikistan. They've retaken, there are 22 sub-valleys, smaller valleys in the Panjshir Valley that are on the sides. They've retaken 11 of those 22 valleys now. And there is a fighting already going on, and their plan is to, and they will succeed. The intelligence officer told me they expect that the Panjshir Valley will fall back under the control of the Panjshiris. Now, I asked whether there's fighting in other areas of the country, and they said there is. It's not on a huge scale yet, but it will be. There's going to be resistance, particularly as things deteriorate in terms of people's nutritional condition. Which brings me to another question, Ryan. AID spent over 20 years, $19 billion on these reconstruction programs. And again, I started a lot of this for the last 4 years of my time as the aid administrator. Should we continue any of this development work? One, and two, we do in this aid work make a distinction between long-term development and humanitarian assistance to keep people alive who are at risk of starving to death or dying in a pandemic. Should we provide any humanitarian assistance now that it appears that a famine is developing in the country?
I think we absolutely must provide humanitarian assistance, and we are doing so, I'm told. We should do absolutely nothing on the developmental side. That would imply support for and recognition of the Taliban regime, and to me, that would be unthinkable. But on the humanitarian level, we're going to have to be careful. The Taliban are not stupid. They will recall what Saddam Hussein did with the oil for food program in Iraq, where he was able really to paint us as the source of the suffering of the Iraqi people. And it worked. So stand by for that one, that the hardships Afghans will undoubtedly face as we move into the winter season. The Taliban is going to do its level best to blame on the international community and on us in particular. We really have to be on guard against that. We have got to have the data. We have to be able to show what is going where with our humanitarian assistance and how shortfalls, if any, are really at the feet of the government of Afghanistan, which is now the Taliban, because they're going to be doing their level best to blame us for it. You can stand by for those bulletins. So I think we got to have a very robust conversation with agencies such as the World Food Program, which is traditionally run by an American and is now, to be sure that the narrative is spun in a way that puts the blame where it belongs, which will be on the Taliban, not on us. But our adversaries are going to be working that piece pretty hard.
Just so people know, the United States does not provide humanitarian assistance, particularly in a civil war or in a conflict, to the government of any country. We go through internationally known NGOs that do work, the humanitarian assistance work in famines and civil wars. We go through the World Food Program and UNICEF, which does a lot of health work, and the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. All of them have very high standards of accountability, and we don't go through governments because we've learned long ago, particularly in highly politicized settings, that the money or the food will disappear. So we don't go through them. We go through these other organizations that have a good track record. What do you think the role, the relationship the United States will have with the Taliban will be in the future? There is a report that we met for the first time, I think it was last week, with the Taliban government to, because we haven't recognized them, and I don't think any of the Europeans have recognized them either.
Well, we have extended actually full recognition to them by negotiating that horrifically flawed agreement with them, not with the Afghan government. That agreement was signed by the United States. It was signed by the Taliban. Then Secretary of State Pompeo went to Doha to meet with the Taliban. And let's also not forget that 5 or 6 months before that agreement was reached, President Trump was all set to meet with the Taliban at Camp David. That fell apart because of a Taliban attack that killed an American trooper. So the Taliban have all the recognition they're ever going to need from us already. What we have got to be sure is that we don't make this worse than it already is by treating them as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. As you know, Andrew, we have legislation that blocks, for example, assistance to regimes that overthrow democratically elected governments. Well, that's just what happened in Afghanistan. No one in Washington seems to be talking about that, though.
No, that is exactly correct. That is the statute. It does not apply to humanitarian assistance of people's
Right.
lives. It does apply to long-term development. And so legally, we are not supposed to be providing any assistance in the future. I think the president could issue a waiver. I hope he does not do that in this case.
Andrew, all of yours, the students there and those on the also on this call are aware that before you were USAID administrator, you had run the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance for the United States, and did so very effectively, which is why you are such an authority on what humanitarian assistance is and isn't. It gives you just a unique perspective, as we've just heard.
I actually did that under President Bush 41, our President Bush, HW, for those 4 years. I ran the disaster programs and the food aid programs. So I do know those painfully, because it was a controversial subject sometimes. Why do you think that the Afghan military fell so quickly? There are stories that the commanders were bribed by the Taliban, or they had made deals ahead of time. Do you hear any insight as to why it happened so quickly with no fighting?
Well, it didn't really happen quickly. It happened over a long stretch of time. When I was ambassador, 2011, 2012, each week at the International Security Assistance Force headquarters, there'd be a short solemn ceremony in which the names of troopers from the coalition that had been killed in action the previous week were read aloud. Sadly, there was, I cannot remember a single week in which we did not lose at least one American trooper, and sometimes many more. So those names would be read by an American officer, followed by other coalition country officers as warranted. Their casualties fewer than ours, of course. The last person to the microphone was always an Afghan officer. He didn't read names. He would just say a number: 87, 103, 116. The number of Afghan National Security Forces killed that week, fighting against primarily the Taliban, up to something like 70,000 killed in action overall. So don't tell me that there was no fight in the Afghan National Security Forces. There was plenty of fight. There was a willingness to step up and, if necessary, die for the new country of Afghanistan, the new state of Afghanistan that we were helping them create. So to hear the President of the United States, having blamed everybody else, then blaming the Afghan security forces for their abject surrender, is frankly, to me, contemptible. We sold them out. They are not stupid. They knew what the import of those Taliban US talks without the Afghan government was going to be. They dealt with the consequences of those 5,000 fighters and commanders that we sprung from Afghan jails and put back into the fight against them. And there's more. We had decided to develop an Afghan security force, particularly the Army, on an American model, which meant relatively small contingents far forward to project power to all parts of the country, that had to rely critically on air support for close air support against enemy fighters, but also resupply, medical evacuation. So these contingents were able to project that power, but it required air support all the way. Well, the Afghans are pretty good pilots, but our airframes are really complex, very hard to maintain. It's done by American contractors. And in those contracts, it is written that if our forces withdraw, the contractors withdraw with them. So in addition to the other elements that I mentioned, those forward deployed troops were no longer getting close air support or anything else. No butter, no bullets. And of course, they had seen what had happened in our Doha negotiations. Frankly, given that we had abandoned them to their enemy, I would have found it extraordinary had they done anything other than what they did, which is to say, this is over. We're done.
I want to just go back a minute, how the Taliban, because I think we need to remind ourselves, given what's happening in Sudan literally right now, how the Taliban came to embrace al-Qaeda. Bin Laden was in London, and a man named Hassan al-Turabi, the leader of the radical Islamists, it's the Muslim Brotherhood basically in Sudan, invited him to come in the mid-1990s to Khartoum. And his house is, he rented a car, he lived there for 5 or 6 years. His son went into business with Hassan al-Turabi's son, buying racehorses. Hassan al-Turabi's niece married bin Laden. One of his, if you notice in the news media, they said one of his wives was Sudanese. That's Turabi's niece. After the attempted assassination of President Mubarak in an African Union meeting in Addis, orchestrated by Turabi from Sudan, there was almost a war between Egypt and Sudan over this. The United States, the Clinton administration, put heavy pressure to force bin Laden out of, because we knew bin Laden had been behind the first attempt to blow up the trade towers in New York. It took place in the early 90s. And Turabi arranged for him to go to Afghanistan. The reason I raise this is now the military is still dominated by the Islamists in Khartoum are making waves to try to unseat the civilian secular government there. We have a national interest in not allowing the radical Islamists to take control of Sudan again. We already saw what they did once. We don't need them back in power. And yet I don't see any big initiative by, we don't even have a senior ambassador there right now. I don't understand why the administration is not focusing on this. They do have an excellent envoy for the Horn of Africa, Jeff Feltman, who I have great respect for. But in terms of a senior career diplomat in Khartoum as a posted ambassador, we don't have that now. And that is how bin Laden went to Afghanistan in the first place, to start this whole thing. So I think by neglect, we allow some of these things to happen. And I think it's a failure of leadership myself.
Well, it's also worth noting in that the Taliban had a choice. We gave it to them after 9/11. Hand over the al-Qaeda leadership and we'll leave you alone. They chose defeat and an exile that went on for 20 years, rather than betray their al-Qaeda allies. What does that suggest they're going to do now? Well, we already know what they're doing. Al-Qaeda is welcome again in Afghanistan. And we've seen one senior al-Qaeda official responsible for security under Osama bin Laden is now back in Jalalabad and holding a press conference to announce it. So again, it is hard to fathom the thinking of President Trump or President Biden on this. They have both contributed to a catastrophic setback for the United States in terms of our leadership, our values, and our national security. It's not theoretical in Afghanistan. We were attacked by al-Qaeda coming out of Afghanistan on 9/11. Well, they're putting the band back together again as the result of our catastrophic policies. And I think we're going to have to take a very sober assessment here. We are far stronger defensively than we were in 9/11, but as any Red Sox player can tell you, you can't win the game purely by playing defense.
What have we learned as a country? Now, some people are are saying we've learned that state building doesn't work, a nation building doesn't work, which, by the way, as I said before, historically, that is simply not true. And we should stop using the word. Frank Fukuyama wrote a whole book about this. Stop saying nation building. Nation building is not what aid does or the UN does or anyone else. We do state building. And the question is, what have we learned from this and other previous engagements by the United States that we ignored in Afghanistan?
The most salient point for me is what I call strategic patience. That it takes a long time to affect lasting and meaningful change in an international environment. Educating girls and women, encourage them, as we did, to run for parliament, to join the military, to start businesses. They did all those things, the women of Afghanistan. Implicit in that was, you step forward and we've got your back, until we didn't anymore. We just got tired of it and didn't care too much about consequences. Well, now we get to find out what those consequences are. But I would suggest to you that that is a fact now, our lack of patience, that is going to make our allies quite suspicious of how long we're going to be around in a given endeavor, and our enemies to count on it, outlast them, make them bleed, and they will go. They will get tired of it. They will move on to something else. So that's how the world is looking at the U.S., again, both our allies and our adversaries. And it is an extremely dangerous position for us to be in, and indeed for the entire international community to be in. Back-to-back presidents who could not be more different in every other respect seem to have agreed that time to let this one go. We're not losing large numbers of troopers. It's a tiny fraction of the cost it was at its peak, but we're done, we're gone. So for, again, President Trump to start that and President Biden to finish it. And oh, by the way, I have my own mantras, like you, on nation building. In fact, you don't end a war by withdrawing your forces. You simply hand the battlefield to your adversary. That's what we've done. The whole world has the image of American defeat at the hands of raggedy Taliban fighters in plastic sandals. Well, that is going to reverberate around the world for a very long time to come. I can't predict the consequences, but I don't think they're going to be pleasant.
I think the Chinese may be empowered by this. I'm very worried about that. They're taking a message that maybe they can do what they want to in Asia militarily, and we will not oppose them. That's the message. Yeah, other countries don't listen to our rhetoric. They watch what we do. That's what people remember. It's what we actually do. Speeches are one thing. We kept troops in Japan. We still have troops in Japan. We still have troops in South Korea. We still have troops in Germany. And we rebuilt those three countries following the Korean War and following World War II. So we didn't withdraw from those countries, although there's been efforts to try to reduce the size of the presence there. We didn't leave. One of the mistakes we made in General McChrystal's strategy, which our career officers in AID told him, and he admitted that was a mistake later on, it's a little bit late, which is the strategy will be to take areas from the Taliban, hold the areas, and then do reconstruction there and development. The problem is that the military timeline is 2 years, maybe 3 years. The AID timeline is 15, 20 to 25 years. And so this time horizon gap between the Pentagon and state and AID on the other side is quite profound. And it was a major mistake thinking that somehow in 2 or 3 years, we were going to create stable communities all over the country. We did stabilize many areas, but the other mistake we made, I think, is I know a mission director, I'm not going to mention his name, told me he was given orders in, not when you were ambassador, it was by the White House to, it was, I think it was in 2015, maybe, he was told to put 80% of aid resources into the Taliban controlled area, which is dominated by the Pushtun, one of the big tribes, the largest tribe. Now, the problem is, anytime we'd work with someone, the next day, it was visible we were working, their throats would be slit. So the military didn't control the town, the village the whole time, US military. They controlled it during the daylight hours. At night, the Taliban controlled it, and they would send a message, just slit their throats and leave the body in the irrigation ditches. And it was done all over that area. The rest of the country, all the other ethnic groups, which make up 60% of the country, had all the resources sucked out of that area, those areas, to provide aid there. The other areas were far more stable. It seems to me it was a strategic mistake to do what they did and focus 80% of the resources in the very areas that were not cooperating with the central government or the United States, and take them out of the areas that were cooperating with us. What's the message? If you oppose the United States, you get more development assistance. That's not the right message. Anyway, let me ask, we've got 5 minutes left. Do you think this is the end of liberal interventionism? I mean, one person asked that. I have to say, I'm not a liberal internationalist at all. And this is not a liberal, this is a realist position. And now it is aggressive realism, admittedly, but it is realism. Realism is what we did in South Korea and Taiwan and Indonesia and in Thailand, all of it to oppose Soviet expansionism and expansionism of Mao's China during the Cold War. We did that for realist purposes, not just for liberal internationalism. But do you think this is the end of liberal internationalism as a view of foreign policy?
I would use a different phrase, global leadership, if you will. I think it's the same concept. Well, look, as take the last 100 years, World War I, the United States steps onto the international stage in a big way. The American forces were substantially engaged, late to the fight, admittedly, but decisively there. And of course, General Pershing's famous salute to Lafayette in Paris. Lafayette, we are here. But we didn't stay. The French and the British wanted to see no part of us trying to affect things in parts of the world that they considered theirs as imperial powers. And the American people in Congress wanted no part of it either. The return of an isolationist Senate guaranteed that we would not join the League of Nations, which was Wilson's creation. We were back to Fortress America. What happened next? Well, there was roughly a 2-decade truce between two halves of a fearful world war. That's all it was, 1919, 1939. Again, we are on the stage in a big way in World War II. This time it's different. We're going to stay. We're going to stay engaged. The Roosevelt administration put in place the structures of a new world order while the war was going on. The San Francisco Conference to create the United Nations, the Bretton Woods Agreement on the dollar to replace the gold standard in international finance. And for decades, we saw that leadership role seized by Republican and Democratic presidents. We weren't running the world, we were leading. Granted, a lot of that was in a Cold War context, but it went well beyond the Cold War, as we saw after 1990 and the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, as an example, where we led the world in overturning the seizure of a country by another country. That was called into question, though, by President Obama, who wondered publicly about our so-called allies in NATO and in the Middle East, who decided that the refugee crisis in Syria was maybe a Middle East problem or a European problem. It wasn't an American problem. The Russians capitalized on that, of course, bringing Europe with its refugee flows to the greatest point of disunity since World War II. And then President Trump put it on steroids, pulling us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris climate agreements, the Iran nuclear deal. It was America in retreat. President Biden was going to fix that. He not only has not fixed it, he has amplified it, as we've seen, for example, in Afghanistan. So it's a real question. Will the United States continue to lead in the world? And if we don't, what happens? Well, you revert to a balance of power system, which is great until it gets unbalanced. And an unbalanced balance of power system is what gave us 2 world wars. Do we think it can never happen again? Really? I mean, World War II and the Holocaust are still in living memory. That's kind of the dark alley you go down if the US isn't leading. So I would be greatly concerned on this exact point. Will we lead or will we not? And if we will not, what are we looking at for our children and our children's children?
At that point, we're now at 7 o'clock. We will end our conversation. Ryan, thank you for being with us. There's a lot to consider from what you've told us, but thank you for being with us and giving us your wisdom about what's happening. Good night.
Good night to you. Great to have you there, and good luck to all.
Thank you.